this program is part of that work. It's about the idea of how do we explain LGBTQ plus identity to everyone, because I believe the world isn't going to be safe for LGBTQ plus people until we change the culture of the world, until we bring a lot more information and education into the world. We do need to create safe spaces and bubbles and little places where people feel that they can be themselves, but ultimately we also have to exist in the world. And so the world has to learn and change. And so this program is one that's designed for people who are inside the community. I think and I'll just say that there's going to be stuff that's useful there too for everybody, but I think it's also perhaps a way to help people think about, how do you talk about these things? How do you teach these things? Like, what information can you share with other people who are not in this room today that might actually help them understand things better, and again, pass the information along, because information needs to get out far and wide. Whoops, this way. Will this thing work, Samuel? So my clicker is not working for... Can you bring it closer? Okay, there we go. So first thing I want to say is that we are in a time of dramatic change. Things are changing really quickly around LGBTQ plus issues. Language is changing, understanding is changing, our definitions of community, everything's changing. It's just changing so quickly. It's changing more quickly than it's ever changed before. Oh, this is weird. Okay, it's not working. Can I have the laptop right here next to me then? And the other thing, it's happening, and it's happening quickly. So just very quickly, I just wanted to ask if folks could answer the following question, like, what legal, cultural, social changes have you seen in recent years for LGBTQ plus people? Like, how have things changed? And I'm thinking about things like media, I'm thinking about cultural representation, I'm thinking about language, terminology, legal issues, anything at all.
Not just like gay, lesbian, bisexual, but like asexual, and just like the kind of sexualities that people forget about and stuff like that. So
absolutely, more representation on TV shows, and not just LGBT, but all the other letters. For example, there's a show One Day at a Time, the new version of it, which has a character who's non-binary, and another character who's a lesbian, but that's within the alphabet. But yeah, so like more and more identities are being represented, intersex, asexual, things like that. Other changes.
Kind of going off that, the representation is that you're more than just one identity. There's intersectionality in that representation, but there's also, you get to be more than gay, you get to be a gay lawyer, for example. Like, that used to be just this sole kind of connection to who that person was. As well as there's more bi representation, that we're not just villains and crappy people.
Yeah, in the old days, bi people were represented in things like Basic Instinct, like we were mostly murderers and like psychopaths and stuff. Yeah. Now we are still represented that way sometimes, but we're also represented as doctors and lawyers and waitresses and people. Yeah. It's nice to be represented as a person. Yeah. Other changes that you've seen?
I noticed it's just more like LGBTQ plus specific mental health services. Certainly there's more of an outlet and space and specific to that population.
Definitely more community specific services. Right. Absolutely. Other changes?
See the shift in normalizing that people in the community are human too. So just as much as we celebrate that they are getting married,
we also understand that they might go through divorces. We also understand there might be fissures within the community that we're coming to hear about more often. So as much as like, I love TikTok and I love LGBTQ plus TikTok. And so to hear them talk about their celebrations, but also their more human sides as well, and some of the different arguments that they may have amongst each other, it's just starting to normalize the way that the rest of us normalize those types of tensions.
Yeah, so more not to the word, to be just more representation of LGBTQ plus people in all of our complexities, and just like other people, like just being represented as full humans, which I think ties back in with what you said. So more three-dimensional representations of us as actually people with lives. Imagine that. Other changes, how about legal changes? Married. That's a good one. What else?
Was there a state where they're changing it so on your ID, like driver's license, you can say you're either non-binary or transgender?
Yes, there are several states where you can actually have an X on your driver's license instead of M or F. And Massachusetts is actually, they just passed it in the Massachusetts State House, and now it's moved to the Senate. So, yes. Adoption policies. There are very few states that still have weird adoption policies. There are a few that do, but most of them have caught up to the world. Mm-hmm. Okay, Anna.
Yes, I wanted to, did you call on me? I'm sorry.
I did.
Okay, hi, thank you. I just wanted to say, like, in terms of documentaries, I've seen on Netflix, there's just so many more offerings that are providing, personal stories, but also, one that I'm thinking is the Pray the Gay Away, which was on gay conversion therapy. So to kind of learn about those oppressive practices, and also there was a really good documentary on transgender representations in film, and that was just such a good documentary. So I'm seeing a lot better documentaries and stories in terms of like maybe say like 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think the bottom line is that lots of legal things have changed, like don't ask, don't tell, and trans equal rights bills in a lot of states, not all states, but in some states. And then also just cultural representation, as Anna just said, and as a few other people have said, has really changed. Like you can turn on almost any television station now and find like representation. When I came out as bi, there was nothing. There were a couple of characters that were gay, but they didn't say that out loud. They didn't say the actual word. They just kind of gave you little clues. But things are like this, it's different. It's a different world now. There is actually representation. I don't think that a young person who has access to the internet and television, or at least like streaming stuff, right, doesn't have access to information about LGBTQ plus people that is nuanced and complex and shows a variety of representations, because that's another thing that has changed. It used to be Ellen and Will and Grace, and now there's Pose, and a lot of other shows that just give much more diverse representations, and thank goodness for that.
The medical and mental health definitions, just the classifications of where people in the community fall in textbooks, so to speak, and even language within those areas, like gender affirmation surgeries and things like that.
Yeah, the language in medical usage is evolving. Yeah, gender affirmation surgery, for example, as opposed to, or gender confirmation surgery, like there are different terms that are used now that are much more positive and affirming as opposed to like stigmatizing and medicalizing. Okay. The old-fashioned way. Okay, so as a speaker, that just was to remind me to say something. As a speaker, I've now spoken in 49 US states, and I've spoken in 17 other countries. If you're wondering what the 50th state is, it's Alaska. But I've spoken in all of the other states. And one of the most wonderful things about my work is that it gives me the opportunity to meet people, to have conversations, to hear people tell me about their lives and their experiences and their perspectives and their language, like the language and terminology, everything. I just get to learn, and I try to really soak it up and absorb it and put it back into my work so that I can keep up with what's actually going on in the world, not just in one location where I happen to live, but you know, in a broader way. And one of the things I often do is I have dinner with a bunch of students, which I love doing when I travel. I love just sitting down with some people and just having an unscripted conversation and just see what happens. And a couple of years ago, I started asking a very specific question just to see what happens. And I actually asked a question and I took notes. And the question was, so the framing of this is that in every location, LGBTQ plus folks create spaces. We create safe spaces. Sometimes it's an LGBT office or center. Sometimes it's a registered student organization on a campus. Sometimes it's a youth group in a community. Sometimes it's just 5 friends who create a little bubble and spend time together. Sometimes it's on the internet. Sometimes it's in real life. But we create these little bubbles where we feel that we can be more fully ourselves. And within these bubbles, we come up with terminology. We, kind of through practice and talking to each other, we come up with common terminology, with language, with assumptions about just what the world, what is, like what we hold to be true together. And one of the things that it's clear to me is that within our little bubbles, our set of assumptions, our set of understandings is often different from that of the mainstream community. And so the question that I asked students was, what are things that are known within your bubble that are not understood by many of the people with whom you act in your regular life on a daily basis? So could be your boss at your job at the mall, your part-time job at the mall, or it could be some of the kids you went to high school with, or it could be kids from church, or it could be your grandparents. Like, just what are things that we know? What's the secret sauce? And what happened was I did this in different parts of the country. I did this in different kinds of schools, public, private, religious, like all different kinds of schools. And the thing that was amazing was that the lists, there were some things that showed up on almost every list. Every list was different, but there were some things that showed up repeatedly on almost every list. And I wanted to share with you what those things were. I'm going to go through the list really quickly, and then I'll come back to each one. The first one, no surprise, and this did show up on every single list, is pronouns. The next was sex is not the same thing as gender identity, is not the same thing as gender expression, is not the same thing as sexual orientation. Alphabet soup, just the huge number of labels out there. The whole idea of non-binary, both relating to gender identity and also to sexual orientation. The difference between sexual attraction and romantic attraction. The idea of asexuality. The idea that identity is a journey. I'm coming back to all these. Intersectionality, as you said. And the idea that sexual orientation is not the same thing as sexual behavior. And finally, that the stereotypes are mostly not true, or they're not true of most of us, and that they're also very hurtful. So I'm going to go back through all of them more, in slightly more depth. And some of these I think you're already familiar with, but I'm just going to go through them anyway. Pronouns, she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs. My assistant, by the way, is named Asher, and they go by they, them pronouns. They live in Malden, Massachusetts, and they have also suggested that I might want to give more complex gender examples in the future, like Z. They also use Z. So Z uses Z sometimes as their pronoun. So there are a lot of different pronouns, and just understanding that. And you don't have to know all the pronouns, But if somebody tells you what their pronouns are, try to use them. Because mispronouncing someone is like calling them by the wrong name. It feels that deep. It just feels wrong. Like if my name is Robyn and you start calling me Sally, it just doesn't feel right. Sex is not the same thing as gender identity, is not the same thing as gender identity. And this one, it's interesting because I'm just going to say I included sexual orientation because what I have seen in my work is there are some people who really think that if you're gay, it means you're trans, or if you say you're trans, it means you're gay. Like they really don't know even that basic amount of information. To people's defense, it's important to remember that people have not been given good educations through their formal educational systems. Raise your hand if you got a great education about LGBTQ plus people through your high school curriculum. Stop laughing. So I think that that's one of the reasons that there's a lot of misinformation out there. It's not that people are bad. It's that they haven't been given tools. They haven't been given information. They haven't been exposed to some very basic concepts. So we could have an entire conference on the difference between sex and gender. And in fact, I've been to a couple because these are complex concepts. But shorthand, quick version of these is one of the definitions I heard of sex that I thought was helpful was that sex is the parts of your physical body that are related to your reproductive capacity in some way. Hormones. My friend Allison in London says sex is your private bits. So it's complex, right? It's your genes, your hormones, your private bits, etc. Gender, where does your gender live? Point to your gender. Oh, here and here, right? Gender is up here somewhere, right? Gender is our sense of ourselves. It's our understanding of ourselves. It exists in the very upper part of our body. And so gender is, the sex words are words like male, female, or intersex. Gender words are words like man, woman, non-binary, agender, gender fluid, gender queer, etc. Those are all gender words. And they're words that exist up here. And gender expression is how you express the gender that you understand yourself to be. It's how you give off messages, how you costume yourself, or how you behave in order to show people whatever it is that you're trying to show them. So for example, my gender, I identify as a woman. My sex assigned at birth was female, and I identify as a woman. What clues am I giving off to my gender? Like how am I performing my gender right now or costuming myself? My hair. What else? Oh, right, I'm still wearing my purse. And my shoes, my purse, the way I'm holding my arms. There's a lot of gendered stuff around like physical, like how you're supposed to stand, how you're supposed to hold yourself. If you're very expressive with your hands, that's considered a woman kind of trait. A lot of guys are told, keep your hands still. Like there's a lot of gendered stuff around behavior. So whether you know people who end every sentence as though it were a question, that's a very gendered behavior. I don't do that. Do I? I try not to do that because that feels very tentative and not strong, but that's considered like a feminine trait. So that's gender expression. And then sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. One of the cute little shorthand things I heard was that gender identity is who you want to wake up as. Sexual orientation is who you want to wake up with. Cute, huh? And these are the kinds of things you can share with other people, that little nuggets that can maybe help them remember that. This is interesting. Look how it's transitioning or not. Okay. Alphabet soup. Just that there are a whole lot of labels. It's endless and ever growing. I do this work full time, and I still come across labels that I've never heard before. And I love that. The ones on the left are all sexual orientation labels. The ones on the right are gender identity labels. It's the idea of non-binary. I think, so much of our culture is binary structured. Even like when people think about race in the United States, they often think of black and white or white and not white. Those are silly binaries that just hide a whole lot of other categories, a whole lot of complexity, a whole lot of people who fit not neatly into one of those two pretend boxes. So just thinking about that in a different way. Sexual attraction, romantic attraction. And again, another cute way to think about that is sexual attraction is who makes you hot. Romantic attraction is who makes you warm. And this is a newer idea. I learned about it from students. But once somebody explained it to me, I thought, oh, of course, that makes so much sense. And for some people, who they're attracted to sexually is not the same as who they're attracted to romantically. For some people, it happens to be the same person or people, right? But just those as two separate ideas. And that, again, like I had never thought about it, but as soon as somebody explained it to me, I was like, oh, yeah, of course. Got that. The idea of asexuality, the idea that how high the dial is on our sexuality varies person to person. Not everybody's the same. Some people are all about sex, like that's they're like driven very heavily by sexual desire. It's very important to them. Other people have zero interest. And the rest of us are somewhere in between those two extremes. I'll also mention that how sexual people are varies throughout our lifespan as well. For example, if you ask the parents of a 4-month-old infant whether they would rather have a wild night of whoopee or get 8 hours of completely uninterrupted sleep, what do you think they would pick? Any actual parents here? What's the answer? Yeah, so just that whole idea that, because of health issues, because of external circumstances, because of all kinds of reasons, how sexual we are varies throughout our lifespan. And the idea that identity is a journey. Very few people wake up one morning, have an epiphany, think, oh, that's what I am. So cool. It's done. Like that's not usually how it happens. Usually what happens is you get clues. At some point you start to notice the clues. And then you start to make sense of yourself. You maybe even some people try on different labels. Like I think that, and then maybe it still does, maybe it doesn't. It's a journey. And quite honestly, like I've identified as bi now for 45 years. And I also identify as queer and as pansexual, but how am I going to be the identity for the rest of my life? I'll tell you at the end of my life. At the end of my life, I can look back and say, oh, it changed, or oh, it didn't change. I really don't know for sure. I think it's going to stay. But I really believe that as you travel through your life, you learn more things about yourself. And those things may or may not change how you understand yourself. They may or may not change how you label yourself. Sometimes new labels will become available. Like even if your actual experience of yourself doesn't change, you might just learn a new word and think, oh, that's a great word. I like that word. I'm going to use that. So it might not be that you've changed, but your environment has changed and given you access to new tools. And the idea of intersectionality. This is something that I don't think it's known universally within the LGBTQ plus community, but I do think it's more commonly known inside that community than in mainstream society. So I'm going to explain what it is, because raise your hand if you learned about intersectionality in high school. Wouldn't the world be different if we had? Raise your hand if you learned about intersectionality as an undergraduate. Graduate student. Never. Okay, we have a variety of responses. So intersectionality is a concept that comes from Black feminist thought. It comes from the writing, teaching, and thinking of Black feminists. The idea of intersectionality has been around since at least the 1970s. I think that's the first time I saw that idea in print. It was an article written by a group called the Combahee River Collective, which was a group of Black feminists based in Boston. And they used the term interlocking oppressions in this manifesto they wrote. About a generation later, a law professor, a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw, actually used the term intersectionality. Everybody make intersections with your fingers in any way that makes sense. Beautiful. So she coined the term intersectionality, and the way she used it in this article that I read was that she was writing about the experience that Black women have when engaging with the US legal system. And what she said is that Black women have a very specific experience in that system because they are simultaneously Black and women. And she said you can't separate those things out. They're not Black over here and women over here. They're Black women all the time. And that gives them a very specific experience. And one of her critiques was that in the legal system, if you want to sue somebody for discrimination, for example, you can sue because of racial discrimination, or you can sue because of sex discrimination, but you can't sue because of both of those things. But yet, discrimination and oppression happen sometimes because of both of those things. And she also makes the case that, for example, Black women have a different experience when engaging with the legal system than do Black men, because Black men are also men and Black women are also women. And she makes the argument that Black women have a different experience than women of any other racial identity. So that's intersectionality. As she's talking about how oppression plays out when you have multiple marginalized identities. Underneath the idea of intersectionality is the understanding that all of us have many different identities all at the same time. None of us is just our gender. We are not walking genders. We're actually human beings, and we have genders, we have racial identities, we have geographic identities, we have ethnic identities, we have spiritual or religious identities, we have age identities, we have socioeconomic status identities. We have lots and lots of different identities, ability, disability, et cetera. And every one of our identities interacts and affects how we experience every other identity. And for this reason, when thinking about LGBTQ plus issues, there's no single experience of being a lesbian, for example, because Black lesbians will have a different experience than white lesbians. Asian Pacific Islander lesbians will have a different experience than other lesbians. Like young lesbians will have a different experience than older ones. People who live in rural areas will have a different experience than urban lesbians, and so on and so forth. So it's really just a complication and understanding of identity as deep and multi-layered and always interconnected. The idea that sexual orientation is not the same as sexual behavior. I hear a lot of frustration from people about that. It's like, when I tell someone that I'm bisexual, it doesn't mean, first of all, it's not a sexual invitation. And secondly, when I tell you I identify as bisexual, you still don't know anything about my current sexual behavior. And you also don't know anything about my sexual history. But people think that that's what it means. And just the frustration with that. And then the idea, of course, that the stereotypes are really hurtful. It's really hard to constantly have to bat back against other people's stereotypes and assumptions. It's exhausting. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of population data because I love data. And I think data can tell us a very interesting story about where things are heading. So this is data from Gallup. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Gallup polls. So Gallup is a large organization that does surveys in the United States, I think mostly, and they historically have done telephone surveys. Although now I think they're also doing internet stuff, but this is based on telephone surveys. So they usually call people up and they ask them lots and lots of questions. Some of the questions are demographic, like how many adult children live in your home? How many automobiles do you have? Do you have an air conditioner? I don't know, whatever they're trying to find out. And then they also ask they ask other kinds of questions as well. And so in 2012, they added a question to their survey, which was, do you personally identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? Before we look at the numbers, I do want to say that I don't think these numbers represent actual numbers, because I know there are a lot of people who wouldn't feel comfortable talking to a stranger on the phone about these kinds of questions. So I think what these numbers actually represent is the percentage of people who are comfortable telling a stranger on the phone how they identify. So in 2012, 3.5% of the respondents said yes when asked if they identified as LGBT. The number goes up every year that they ask the question. And in 2017, it does a nice little jump. And then in 2020, it does a huge jump. So that by 2020, it's gone up to 5.6%, which is a really big jump from 3.5 to 5.6 in 8 years. So a lot more people are feeling comfortable. When you break it out by age, here's where it gets really interesting. You don't need to remember the numbers, just look at the pattern. The bottom line is a group that they call traditionalists, which is people born before 1945. For that group, 1 point something% of the people said yes. For the next group, which is baby boomers, it's 2 point something%. For the next group, which is Gen X, which is people born between 1965 and 1979, it's 3 point something%. Are we seeing a very clear pattern already? Now we go up to millennials, 1980 to 1996. It starts off in 2012 at 5.8%, which is already a much larger number. And it not only stays higher, but it grows. So that by 2020, it's up to 9.1%. That's big. That's almost 1 in 10. And now up in the right-hand corner is that little 15.9%. That is Gen Z. That's the oldest people in Gen Z, the people who were old enough to actually be old enough to be surveyed. That's not even all of Gen Z. That's the old folks in Gen Z, people born between 1997 and 2002. Who here is in that group? Wow, half the room. Mm-hmm. So for that group, it was 15.9%. And just for non-mathematicians, that's about 1 in 6. Gen Z folks felt comfortable telling a stranger on the phone that they personally identified as LGBTQ. So that's huge. So that's the trend that we're having around from Gallup. Now, in terms of within LGB, how people are identifying, that's also something that's changing. So this is a general social survey data, and it's another large population data. I think it was done by Internet Study. People filled out stuff on the internet. And it's 10 years of data. Now for lesbian and gay folks, it started off as 1.6%. 10 years later, it's 1.7%. So it's pretty, steady over time. And if you drew a pie chart of the left-hand side of the 2012 data, if you drew a line of the proportion of bisexual folks compared to lesbian and gay folks, it would be about 2/3 lesbian and gay, 1/3 bisexual. 10 years later, in 2018, the number of people identifying as bisexual has tripled. And if you drew a pie chart in 2018 of bisexual, lesbian, and gay people, now lesbian and gay is 1/3, and bisexual is 2/3. That's a big, big change. And again, it's not because bisexual people are stealing away lesbian and gay people, because that number stays steady. It's because more and more people are identifying as bi. Now, if you ask people a different question, instead of saying, what are you? What if you said, where are you? So this is a question that doesn't ask people about words. It's about location. So they showed people a sexuality continuum with one end being attracted to other. I don't say different. I don't say opposite. I say other or different. People attracted to different gender people only. And the other side is people attracted to their own gender only. This is from YouGov, which is again also done on the internet. And what they found, this is broken out by age. What they found, and let's look at the right-hand chart first. People who are 55 and above, 84% of them put themselves on the straightest of the 7 numbers. 7% on the gayest of the 7 numbers, and only 7% on all of the other 5 numbers combined. So that's a very binary construction, weighing very heavily on the straight side. If you go over to the left to millennials, it looks really different. First of all, only 55% put themselves on the straightest number. That's just over half. And a full third put themselves in the middle 5 numbers. So it's a really big change, which I think is similar to the change we saw with words in the previous slide. So this is data from high school age students. Every 2 years, the Center for Disease Control does a survey of high school age students in the United States. And what they do is they administer the survey in representative schools around the United States. So they pick schools that together look like the demographics of the country. And raise your hand if you ever filled that out when you were in high school. It's about 100 questions. Wow, 2 people. You do? 3 people. You must be very representative of something. So yeah, so they in 2015, for the very first time, they added a sexual orientation question to the survey. It's my understanding that they were also supposed to add a gender identity question in 2017, but something happened in 2016 and the question was never added. Luckily, they didn't remove the sexual orientation question. It somehow slipped through. So in 2015, for the first time, they added this question, which was, which of the following best describes you? A, heterosexual, parentheses, straight. B, gay or lesbian. C, bisexual. D, not sure. Raise your hand if you think this is a problematic question. What's wrong with it? Like, what don't you like about it? It doesn't have any nuance. Yeah.
I mean, I just don't think it's like very representative. It's just very, just 3 things there.
There's a number of options to choose from, is there? Yeah, I think it's not a great question at all. I showed this, one of my mentors came out as bisexual when he was 12, and he's now 16. And he's my go-to person for a lot of things. Like, we have lots and lots of talks and lunches, and just it's really interesting to get a sense of what the world looks like through his eyes. And I showed him this question when he was 13. I put it in front of him. I said, "What do you think, Lewis?" And he said, "Where are all the other words?" And I said, "I love you." And he said, "And why do they explain heterosexual and they don't explain the other words? What's with that?" And I said, "I love you more." And he said, "And why do they put straight first? I don't like that." And I was like, "I love you the most." Like, I just do. I do. And so, like, I think most young people who look at this question, and then I spoke to someone who identifies as asexual, who was looking at this question and said, "I don't even know how I would answer that. I don't know how I would answer that. Like, maybe I'd put bisexual because it's the closest, but I'm asexual. I'm not bisexual, really. And maybe then I'd put not sure, but I am sure. I'm sure I'm asexual." And so they were like, "I don't even know. I don't even know what I would do there." And so I think that when you ask a problematic question, you actually don't get, authentic answers. That said, they use these kinds of questions over and over, sometimes because they want to be able to compare apples to apples. They want to be able to compare a survey done over here to a survey done over there. They want to be able to compare surveys over time. But as our culture and language changes rapidly, it means sometimes that the questions are very bad fits. That said, I'm so glad there was a question, because having a question means that we can, first of all, get a sense of what's going on in terms of numbers, but we can also, if we have this question, we can say, how are, for example, gay, lesbian, and bisexual students doing compared to heterosexual students? Are they more or less suicidal? Are they more or less depressed? Are they more or less bullied? Like, all the different things that survey asks about. Anyway, here's what they found. In 2015, the first time they asked the question, 89% heterosexual, 2% gay or lesbian, 6% bisexual, and 3.2% said not sure. 2 years later, gay and lesbian heterosexual goes down, actually a nice like 4%. Gay and lesbian goes up about 10%. Bisexual goes up by a full third. And not sure goes up by about 10%. And by the way, I showed this data. I was really excited when this came out, and I showed it to Lewis. And I said, look, 8% identify as bisexual. And he looked at it and he said, that's all? He said, I thought it would be higher. And again, perspective. 2 years later, heterosexual goes down another percentage point. Gay and lesbian goes up a tiny, tiny bit. Bisexual goes up another 10%. And not sure goes up a lot. And I think that is in part representing some of the other words that weren't included in the question. But when you add this up, if you add up gay, lesbian, bisexual, and not sure, it's 10.2, 10.7, 14.7. So it's getting close to what Gallup found. Now, the Trevor Project is a national youth serving organization that focuses on LGBTQ plus youth. And they did a survey of, I think it was something like 14,000 LGBTQ young people. So this is not a random sample of the population like the CDC study. This is youth who were in some way connected enough to be able to even know that the survey was happening. And so what they found was that a third of their respondents identified as lesbian or gay, about a third as bi, another 17% additional as pan, another 10% is queer, and then not sure and straight. They also found some interesting stuff about gender identity. They found that 15% of their respondents identified as gender nonconforming, non-binary, or gender fluid, and another 5% were questioning their gender. That's a very large number. And it's something that I actually see in real life. I meet more and more people, who identify outside of the gender binary. So just overall where we're heading, this is where we're heading. Less straight, less cisgender. Cisgender means that you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. Less binary, I think in many different ways, not just gender and sex and sexual orientation, but in other ways as well. Interesting slide trick here. Okay, this is back to Trevor. So one of the other things about Trevor is they found when they asked the question about sexual orientation identity, they didn't ask you to pick A, B, C, or D. They said write it in. They had over 100 different sexual orientations that youth wrote in, and there were 100 different gender identity labels. So this is what happens when you don't, try to squeeze people into the boxes, but ask them a real question and let them answer it. So this is a question I ask myself a lot. Like, is this just a US thing? Or even is this just a Western thing? Or is this something that is happening more broadly? So finally this summer, for me, this is like early Christmas or something, like a treasure hunt. I love data. I found a poll, an Ipsos poll, that answered that question. They surveyed people in 27 different countries, covering Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, South America, et cetera. I don't think they did the Arctic areas, but covering all the populated parts of the world rather. And they broke it out by age, this data. So in each country, they surveyed either 500 or 1,000 people, depending on the country. But it's 27 different countries all combined in this data. So for gender identity, what they found, people identifying as transgender, non-binary, gender conforming, gender fluid, et cetera. For people who were baby boomers, it was less than 1%. For Gen X, it's 1%. For millennials, it's 2%. For Gen Z, it's 4%. Sexual orientation. This is broken out by individual identity as well, but first you can just look at the length of the bar graph. It gets dramatically larger with each succeeding age cohort. And for actual identity, like gay and lesbian goes 1% for the oldest group, 2% for the next group, 3%, and then 4%. But look at bisexual. It goes 2, 3, 4, 9. And also what we see is the rise of asexual and pansexual. So these are all things that are happening, and they're happening again, younger folks, mostly. So the answer to that question is no. That said, I do think it's really important to understand that different words have different meanings in different places. For example, the word gay, and this is true both in different countries, but also even within the United States. Like the word gay can sometimes mean men who are only attracted to other men. The word gay can also mean all LGBTQ plus people. Sometimes women call themselves gay, right? So gay has lots of different meanings, and it's used in different places by different people in different ways. Also, on the ground, reality is very different in different places. You know, there are still close to 70 countries where it is not legal to engage in same-sex behavior, and where you can be imprisoned and in a few countries put to death because of that. So obviously the numbers of people who would come out in a public poll would be different. And I don't think it's necessarily because people aren't there, but because it's not safe. I think, you know, there are countries where it's not comfortable. There aren't youth groups where you can go talk about your identity. It's just not safe. And if you tell people, you will be kicked out of your family or your village or your home, etc. And then back to intersectionality for a second, just also, this data is also affected by intersectionality, right? Because all of our other identities affect and shape whether it's comfortable or safe to be out. They affect what's on the menu, what words or terms or resources are available to each of us. And the whole idea of intersectionality shaped the way I do all my work. I used to think that if I got up and told you my story, like my personal story, that you would then understand what it meant to be bisexual. I don't believe that anymore. I believe that in order to understand the experience of any specific identity, you need many different stories. And if you take many stories, read them or watch them and put them together in your mind and synthesize it, then together you can understand more about what it is to be that identity. Because it's never one thing, never one experience. And so all of my work now focuses on creating, basically building a stage, inviting people, multiple people, to come share their stories. So the first project I did was this book called Getting By in the middle. It's a 42-country anthology. Very grassroots, not polished. Most people in the book had never written before. It was just like first time, exciting, you know, just getting people to tell their stories. The second book on the left is called Recognize the Voices of Bisexual Men. And I did that book because I believe that men have a very specific experience of being erased, bisexual men. In our culture, I think that their experience is different from that of women because women's sexuality is trivialized. Men are taken more seriously, and so it's more dangerous to be a bi man. The stereotypes about bi women are that all bi women are really straight and just going to be tourists in gay town. Right? They're just dabbling. And the stereotypes about bi men are that they're all really gay. And that's also the intersection of sexism and heterosexism. Because ultimately the stereotypes are that everybody wants to be with a man. Yes, you saw that's why I'm not wearing a mask. And then the third project I do is Bi Women Quarterly. And I love this publication. It's a small grassroots publication that's been around since 1983. We just operate on a budget that's tiny. Like we just basically make it happen. And every issue has a theme. Like the issue of the theme there was out at work or not. The current issue that we have out is on bodies. The next one's going to be on rich traditions. And the one after that's going to be on bi plus health. Like we just do different topics. And then I try to get people to come and write and submit artwork and poetry and short essays and very short stories. And it's just getting a lot of people. And I make sure that there are people of varying ages and racial identities and geographic identities and gender identities. There are always trans and non-binary voices represented in the publication. Like just really trying to make sure it looks like as close as possible to how people look and not just one kind of people. And I'm very proud of that publication because I think for some people it is their support. It is their place to find validation. And we offer free digital subscriptions to anyone of any gender and any identity who's interested in reading it. It's free. There's a clipboard over there. I gave away all my copies last night. So I don't have any actual paper copies, but it's free. So if you want to sign up on the clipboard at the end, you're absolutely welcome to. It's free. You'll get an email every 3 months with a link to the issue. It's also available on the web at bywomenquarterly.com. And again, I'm just so proud of it because it's grassroots, because we have just made this thing happen and created this amazing space. And nobody gets paid except the intern, because I do pay my interns. Just want to very quickly touch on the specific challenges of navigating invisible identities. If your identity is written on your body, if it's visibly apparent, for example, if you are in a wheelchair, or if your skin is black or brown, or if you are wearing a hijab, or things like that, then every interaction that you have with every other person face to face is going to be filtered through their stereotypes or perceptions of what your identity means. And I'll add gender to that, right? So, for example, every time I interact with someone, they're interacting with what they think woman means and what they expect a woman to be like or act like. And so it's always distorted. It means every interaction I have with every other person is distorted by their stereotypes or limitations. And that's got to be exhausting, right? It's got to be exhausting. You can never say, I don't feel like dealing with depression today, so I'm just not going to show that thing. Because you can't go out in public and not show your skin color, or if you're in a wheelchair, et cetera. You just can't. It's not an option. If your identity is invisible, that's a different experience of oppression. And I'm not ever weighing and measuring, because I don't think that Audre Lorde said there is no hierarchy of oppression. Like, I don't think that it's productive to do that. I think all oppression is terrible and hurtful. They just hurt in different ways. If your identity is invisible, that gives you a specific experience of oppression. It means that nobody knows you're even there. And that means that every interaction you have with every other person is in some way inauthentic, because they're interacting with someone that they imagine who's not actually you. And in order to have an authentic interaction with them, you need to take action. You need to come out. You need to tell them. And that is its own thing, right? I know, and I don't. One thing I'll say to everybody who's not LGBTQ, if somebody comes out to you, it didn't just happen on a spontaneous whim. They probably thought about it long and hard. They probably weighed and measured the possible costs or downsides. They were probably afraid of how you might respond if you told them. They probably thought really long and really hard and then decided that in the balance it was worth doing it. So like, coming out is hard. It's exhausting. It means lots of internal negotiations, writing scripts of what you're going to say. How am I going to bring this up? And it's really hard. Sexual orientation is actually a hard thing to bring up out of context. Like, speaking of bisexuality, which we weren't, I am. Like, it's hard to even think about how do you bring it up. So that's a challenge. And then also, like, the fear I have of how other people might react weighs very heavy on me. And this is true for sexual orientation. This is true for people's gender identity. This is true for a lot of invisible disabilities. There are a lot of disabilities that aren't visible, learning disabilities or depression, or like all kinds of other things that people have to deal with. There are a lot of things that we live with that are not obvious. Also, some religious identities, like for men who are Muslim, that's not visible. For women, it is because of the attire they're expected to wear, but for men, it's not. For most Jewish people aren't visible unless they are wearing, some sort of garb or thing like that. Like, there are a lot of identities that are not visible. I just want to recognize the specific challenge of that. And LGBTQ folks deal with that all the time. Another thing that we deal with is that we don't have families to teach us how to be ourselves in the world. Some people do, but a small number of LGBT people come from LGBTQ families. Most people have to figure it out separate from their families on their own. And that's also challenging because no one's navigating you. And this is another change that I've seen. I really feel like people are using identities in a way that's different from the way they used to. It used to be there was a very limited menu. Well, when I came out, there was gay or straight. And they were like two boxes, and you were supposed to decide which one of those things you were. There's a very big box of straight and the very small box of gay. And you're supposed to decide which one of those things you were, climb inside of it, find the rule book, and be that thing and stay there. You weren't supposed to leave. I fought really hard for a third box. Like I fought really hard to make space in the middle for a third box called bisexual, but I don't think that's how we're using identities anymore, and thank goodness. I think that identities are being used more as descriptive terms to explain ourselves, both to ourselves and also to communicate to other people. And this doesn't mean, like when I say I call myself or identify, I go by, it doesn't mean that we don't have very strong senses of our identities. Like it doesn't mean that, oh, I think I'll call myself bisexual. It's based on a strong sense of oneself, but what words we choose are about communication. So we're using words more as adjectives. Like my knowledge of myself as someone who has been deeply, deeply, deeply attracted to women and deeply, deeply attracted to men and also deeply, deeply attracted to non-binary people over the course of my life, that's strong, and that really hasn't changed. But what word I choose to use to describe that might change. And I also might use different words at different times to talk to different people. I know a lot of people who identify as queer who might not use that word with their grandparents because they use words that they think other people will understand. I know a lot of people who identify as pansexual who use bisexual sometimes because it's more commonly understood. I know people I use bisexual, pansexual, and queer. So like a lot of people use multiple words. This is like a different way of engaging with identity. So just a few best practices, and I was wondering if we could actually read them out loud, go around the room. And these are personal best practices. These are not institutional best practices. These are things that you can do as an individual human being. Do you want to read the first one, Samuel?
Sure. Do your best not to assume someone's sexual orientation or their gender identity.
Remember that knowing who someone's partner is doesn't necessarily predict their sexual orientation label. Remember that you can't always tell who is cis and who is trans. If someone tells you how they would like to be identified, respect their identity, and if you're not sure, please ask.
If you have a close relationship with that person, you might also ask them if they would tell you more about what their identity means to them.
Whenever possible, avoid gender sorting that forces people to choose one of two boxes.
And this is actually mine. I want to say something about two of these, which is that when I used to make up surveys, and I always put gender, I always put sex or gender like on the survey, and then I was like, why am I doing that? It's like when you make a survey, that's what you put. And I thought, well, why do I actually need to know that? Is that relevant? Sometimes it's legal. It's like important to know someone's legal sex because of federal reporting requirements or something. In that case, you should also probably have a gender question, like your legal identity and then how do you actually identify. Fill in the blanks are great in general, if possible, because that allows people to be their complex selves. And then the one about if you have a close personal relationship, I just really believe that because there were so many ways to be lesbian, ways to be bisexual, ways to be trans, all these words have different meanings to different people and different experiences for different people. That in fact, none of us, like those words don't cover the whole story. Those words are just little name tags that we put on ourselves, that every one of us has a complex story. And then if you really want to get to know someone, I'm not talking about a stranger on the bus, but if you really have, if someone comes out to you who's a friend or a family member or someone you care about or a close coworker, like, I think it's actually very thoughtful and polite to say thank you. First of all, thank them for coming out, because coming out again is hard and it's a big deal. So thank them for trusting you and coming out to you. And then if you do want to know what they need, then ask them, say, would you be willing to tell me more about what that identity means to you? After you've had that conversation, then maybe you have some understanding of who they are. But these words are just, they tell very little. Let's turn this yours.
Whenever possible, address people in ways that don't assume gender, such as, hello, everybody. Would y'all like an iced tea or lemonade? And good evening, can I help you? Pronouns matter.
I have a sister in Texas who said that should be sweet tea. Iced tea. I'm sticking with it. And I just want to ask you, what are some additional best practices like for supporting LGBTQ students? What would you add to that list?
Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Learning takes time.
Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Learning takes time. I love that. Thank you. What else?
I mean, I think it's incredibly important to just have like affirming and welcoming messages on your walls. So whether that's Black Lives Matter or rainbow or all are welcome, just like opening the space for that conversation as well by having that on your walls.
Absolutely, because we live in a culture where so many people aren't welcoming. If you're just a nice person who doesn't discriminate, nobody knows that until you say it. Like if I don't know if I don't know your position, then I might not trust you. When I go into any space, if I go into someone's office, for example, I read their bookshelf. I look at their bookcase, if they have books, see what kinds of books they have. I look at their bulletin board. I look at what they have taped to their door. Like I look, and that gives me messages about whether or not this is a comfortable or welcoming space. Other best practices. Anything you do in your classroom?
So I actually used to work at an LGBT center too, so I'm trying to like frame my perspective in a different way. In my classroom, I think our classrooms are a little bit different because I teach in a grad only program. But one of the things that we talk about is whether to ask pronouns and making sure that it's a safe space to ask pronouns and to ask pronouns of everyone and not just one individual that you may think might use a pronoun that's not she or he. That's a pretty common one that folks don't always get. And they don't always get today. I wasn't necessarily surprised that they didn't get it 10 years ago, but yeah, so that's one piece. But then just looking at like, who are the authors that I'm bringing into the classroom? Who are the guest speakers that I'm bringing into the classroom? Even though it might not be related at all to identities, but it's important to show different representations, not just within the LGBTQ community, but lots of other identities.
Yeah, pronouns is super, super important. So, and again, asking it of everyone, putting it in your email signature. Even if it's a pronoun that people would guess if they were guessing your pronoun, just because it's just showing people that that's a thing to think about. When I taught at Tufts, I made little cards and I asked students several questions like contact information, but then I also had a question, what else would you like me to know about you? Is there anything else you would like me to know about you? When people revealed information about learning disabilities or mental health issues or gender identity or just like lots of things that I found actually helpful to me as teacher, which I didn't share with the class because it was private information, but it helped me be more aware of who was actually in the room as opposed to who I imagined was in the room.
I think also like when you're asking about pronouns, just like a little like language thing when you're asking, not using what are your preferred pronouns, but what pronouns do you use or what are your pronouns? Because it's not like these are preferred, but you can kind of, that's you, it's like, no, these are
Right.
my pronouns.
And that's something that's changed over time. 10 years ago, people said, what are your preferred pronouns? Now they say, what are your pronouns? Another way you can do that is share your own first. Like instead of saying, what are your pronouns? Like say, hi, oh, I'm Robyn, I use they, them, I use she, they pronouns. What about you? Like that's a way of opening up and you're not therefore putting them on the spot. You're putting yourself on the spot first, role modeling. Now, sometimes when you ask that, people will say, what? I've had that happen quite a bit, but then it's also an opportunity to explain in a nice, friendly way what pronouns are and why they matter. The floor is open.
Robyn, there's
Oh, Emma.
yes, someone typed in the Jay typed in the chat. Jay, did you want to share your comment? There was
Yeah, for sure. I just appreciate being here in general. This talk has been fantastic. Just something to add just for students, but just everyone in general. I'm an openly queer woman. I am 20 years old. I've been out since I was probably 13 or 14. I grew up in a really conservative community. My gay was prayed away in a public church with everyone in front of me. I experienced a lot of homophobia, and I've been really trying to work on internally getting rid of those behaviors and everything as well. And it's just taken a lot of time for me. So I regularly attend seminars and just different things to just kind of get a better hold and just confirm my identity that this is okay. I am chronically ill. I'm a transplant patient, and I recently had major knee surgery because I broke my knee. My girlfriend was the one who would come and see me, and for a lot of the time, just because in hospitals in general, I've experienced homophobia as well. So typically I just say like, oh, she's my friend, whatever, but I did step up and say, she's actually my girlfriend, she's my partner, she will be coming to visit me. And the provider that happened to be in the room was actually wearing just a regular rainbow flag pin on their badge. And I did thank him just because I just wanted to let him know that that is really important, and that representation does matter. And it makes me feel safer as a patient in general, just like knowing that that's okay. So I just wanted to add that because I know that I'm in Zoom and just not in the group right now, unfortunately, but thank you so much for calling on me.
Thank you, Jay, and you are in the group, even if you're not in the room. Thank you for that. And I think that's so important, like the fact that someone was wearing a rainbow pin, it gives you the signal.
Yeah, exactly. It was very relieving, and he happened to be like my surgeon, who's just this big deal guy, you know, not somebody who, at least in my experience, that I would think would be as open to that. But the fact that he was wearing that badge was just like really fantastic. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Thank you. And then also, I think just also your story, Jay, brings up something else, which I think is important, just remembering that you don't know somebody's story. Like I still remember when there was a point when I was talking to someone and I just thought, why didn't you just come out? Like, what's the big deal? Because I had been out. Like, of course, it was a big deal when I wasn't out.
Yeah.
I was also forgetting my entire past, but like I was thinking, what if, like, but then I found out from my friend that she's Greek American.
Mm-hmm.
And I found out that she told me this, she explained this to me. She actually played a presentation she had made about being a Greek lesbian. And she said that in Greece, any action by any member of a family is seen as the responsibility of the patriarch. Like the father is held responsible for any action that any child does and any family member does, and that being a lesbian was seen as a sign of shame, right? It was something that was shaming. And so she felt that coming out was going to make her father feel ashamed. And by the way, she was one of two sisters, two girls in the family, and they were both lesbians.
Wow.
And yeah, they finally eventually did come out, and their parents considered moving to a place where nobody else knew them. They considered leaving where they were living and moving away somewhere where nobody would know them, because that's how ashamed they felt, how uncomfortable they felt. And so like that helped me understand, like, wow, she had good reasons for being hesitant. Like she shouldn't have had to be hesitant, but she had good reasons.
And my family is very prominent in the church, not necessarily Greek American. I mean, we're all Scandinavian, very traditionally Protestant. My grandparents are Catholic. My grandpa was like very active in the church and everything, and a big moment for me because like I know just organized religion in general, but just Catholicism, being raised Catholic and being sitting in front of the church and hearing all of the horrible things that would happen to me. And I remember when I came out, I was waiting for something just horrible to happen to me. I was waiting and waiting and waiting. And I mean, homophobia, of course, I didn't just disperse into thin air, which was just a complete shock to me. But just, I see churches in Mankato here that are very inclusive and progressive as well. I live down by Lincoln Street by the Cray Mansion, and I know that, I don't know the name of the church, but it has a trans flag in the window. There's an LGBTQ plus flag. There's a lot more progressiveness that I see in organized religion here than I would in my hometown. I was put on in front of the congregation. I was told they were praying for my transplant because I was a transplant patient at the time. And my grandpa tricked me. I went up to the church and there was probably 300 to 100 people there. And it's they prayed my gay away. Brought me up to the front of the church. They started praying and then people started coming up, putting their hands on me, and I didn't understand what was going on. And then I was sitting there waiting for it, like, is it gonna work? Is it gonna work? And it didn't work. And I'm still here. And that's why I feel like learning about it, and just because I'm part of the community doesn't mean that I should stop learning on the better way to treat people. So thank you so much for your time, Robyn.
Thanks for sharing the story.
Thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, happy ending. My friend Leah, who was a gay lesbian, actually did come out to her parents, and 2 years later they got over it. They really did come to accept both of their daughters, and things got better. But just I think just understanding that people have stories that we don't even know, and that's why we can't just go by words. We have to understand that people are complex humans with lots of different stories.
I think too, as we move forward into the future, when I'm just looking at those graphs that you showed us, and thank you for those, by the way, and you look at the different generations, I think going forward in future generations, we're going to have less indoctrination like what this person experienced. And even for people who are not part of that community, there's going to be less indoctrination because we're going to be talking about this more. So I'm excited to see those numbers go up, but too, knowing that we have a lot more exposure through different platforms to talk about it.
Yeah, circling right back to where we started, right? There's so much more information out there now that even when people are given very bad negative messages, there's at least more tools to navigate the world. There's more information out there. I think what I'd like to do, just as a quick wrap up, is invite people. Is there one thing that you want to say about something you're taking away from this session? Optional, but would you like to say anything?
I am also very excited about the number of queer people increasing. I tend to sort of think that where we are and where my identity is accepted is just where it's going to be. But I think that more people coming out will make it easier. And I'm excited to see, hopefully, if there's a tendency, I think, to do sort of gatekeeping and be like, oh, are they really bi or are they really whatever? And there are a lot of other liberation movements that have been centered on trying to like, get more people accepted into the group. And I hope that that is the way that we start going.
Stronger together. Samuel?
For me, I'll say just, as I said, creating a welcoming environment for people that in the community or community, as you said, having like a sign or a symbol or something to show that this is a welcoming environment for them to discuss about their identity or their heritage.
Thank you.
I guess I'm just really excited for like the future generations, because I think it's just going to become more and more like accepting of different people's identities, and just remembering that there's no universal way to be queer, bi, lesbian, you know, like everyone has their own experience. Yeah.
I really appreciate the differentiation you make between being a bi man and the pressures there, bi woman. Because I always wondered why I might have felt more threatened, and the bias that bi men attracted to men, bi women attracted to men, just the overarching patriarchy of everyone is attracted to men. That's just
Where the value lies.
the default. That was good to hear. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'm just so thankful that we live in a world that's becoming better. I would say with lots of additional and new barriers. But being in a world that more and more youth can come out earlier and earlier is heartwarming. And like, I personally wish I had that when I was that age, but I'm sure that like, if we talk about every generation, I'm sure that we can say the same. And I'm hoping that like in another 20 years that we can be like, oh, like 20 years ago it was terrible. Like now it's even better.
Only 1 in 6 then, it was so weird.
I liked all the graphs and the data that you put there, so it makes it more visual for me since I'm not really part of that community. But like I said, I just love continuing to learn because I know I'm gonna be moving through those spaces at some point in my career, and I want to make sure that I'm adding to those spaces or being aware of the space that I'm taking up within those spaces. So.
Are we just doing takeaways?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was gone. Yeah, I mean, I just really appreciate spaces like this, or like these conversations are the ones that I'm most confident and passionate about. And so just being immersed in these spaces is just really good for me.
Do you want to share?
I always love a good conversation about intersectionality. That's really an important discussion to me.
And folks who are on Zoom. Anna.
Yes, I would say I appreciate what you brought in about the Trevor Project. I didn't know anything about the Trevor Project, and also found it to be really, I guess, encouraging and inspiring to see all the new identity labels and the new ways that younger people are identifying and using identity as expression. So I'm really, I guess, encouraged because especially right now with pandemics and then kind of coming out of the Trump administration, I think a lot of us are just really tired. So seeing what younger people are doing and also kind of learning about older folks' experiences, being gay, being lesbian, being bi, I think it's just it adds to the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on Zoom want to share?
I'll share. I'm just very thankful for the space in general, not only just for the sake that some of us identify as queer, but the fact that there are heterosexual people here as well, allies that just really want to make a difference. I feel like that's so important. Just hearing the different conversation professionally, academically, of course, I have a lot of queer friends, so there are resources like Robyn mentioned, that safe space that we create for ourselves. However, academically, I'm not as educated in sexuality and intersectionality and just a lot of the topics that we went over. So I'm just really thankful for that academic space as well.
Thank you. Anyone else on Zoom? Okay, and now I want to just thank everybody. Please raise your hand if you had a part in making this event happen today. Well done. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And thanks for showing up. I know that you're all really busy. And I just appreciate that you made this a priority. And I'm going to be here for lunch, and I'm going to stay afterward as long as anyone wants to talk to me. So I'd love to have more conversations about this, but the formal program is now officially ended. Thank you.
And also we have sign-up sheets for people that can just fill the email out and we'll send email of any other events that are going on this month. So you guys can vote that.
Sweet.
Oh, right on the table over there, besides the food, to the right of the food is a not-for-profit shopping mall. It's my Etsy shop called Byproducts.
I love it.
I have a lot of stuff that I mailed to Minnesota on Saturday, and it arrived in Minneapolis last night after I left Minneapolis. So what I do have are 2/3 of my pins. I have flags, I have earrings, I have 7 different pride flags: bi, pan, trans, non-binary, asexual, Philadelphia rainbow, and then the progress flag, which has the trans and the black and brown stripe. Those are all there. I also have a sign-up sheet for Bi Women Quarterly, which again is a publication I was talking about earlier. It's free, and anyone of any gender and any identity is welcome to sign up. Reading it will not turn you bi if you're not, and it won't turn you into a woman if you're not. But it is the voices of women and also non-binary folks who are comfortable in that space, who choose to be in that space. And it's an amazing publication. If you do identify as that, I also would love to have you write for us or send us visual art or do anything like that, because it's a really, it's an open forum, and I love new writers, I love new artists, I love just when new stuff comes in. So thank you, and let's eat lunch.
Yes.